Nedelin catastrophe, 1960. The rocket was fueled. The engines had misfired. Every safety protocol said clear the pad. Instead, Marshal Nedelin pulled up a chair and sat next to it. On October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, a Soviet R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile sat fully loaded on the launch pad. It had failed to ignite. Engineers were swarming over the rocket while it was still fueled, diagnosing the problem. The propellant inside was hypergolic, two chemicals that ignite the instant they touch. If anything went wrong, there would be no warning, just fire. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, commander of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, had a political deadline. The missile had to be ready before the anniversary of the revolution. He refused to order an evacuation. Every minute spent clearing the pad was another minute of delay. He pulled a chair within meters of the rocket and sat down to supervise personally. At 6:45 p.m., a timer in the second stage misfired. The second stage engines ignited. The rocket had not left the ground. The blast incinerated everything in the immediate area instantly. Burning propellant spread across the pad. Men who ran were caught in liquid fire. Some were found fused to the tarmac. Nedelin was identified only by the metals found in the ash. The death toll was classified for 30 years. Estimates run between 78 and 126 people. The Soviet government announced that Nedelin had died in a plane crash. The survivors were ordered never to speak of it. Engineers who had raised concerns before the explosion were among the dead. No missions are launched from Baikonur on October 24th to this day. For decades, no one explained why. Apollo 1, 1967. They never left the ground. 3 astronauts died on the launch pad, strapped inside a hatch that took 90 seconds to open. On January 27, 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were running a routine ground test aboard Apollo 1 at Kennedy Space Center. No fuel, no liftoff, just a simulation. It was supposed to be the safest kind of day. Engineers had been flagging problems with the capsule for months. The interior was packed with flammable material, nylon netting, Velcro, foam padding. The atmosphere inside was pure oxygen at higher than normal pressure. In that environment, almost anything will ignite. The hatch required a minimum of 90 seconds to open from the inside. All of it had been documented. All of it had been reviewed. The program was behind schedule and racing the Soviet Union to the moon, and there was no appetite for further delays. At 6:31 p.m., a spark ignited inside the capsule. The exact source was never determined. In a pure oxygen environment, the fire spread in seconds. Grissom reported it. He tried to open the hatch. The pressure had already spiked too high to move it. In 17 seconds, all 3 men were dead. It took technicians 5 minutes to open the hatch from outside. The investigation found more than 1,400 flammable items in the capsule, a hatch that opened inward, an atmosphere that turned a short circuit into an oven. The Apollo program was halted for 20 months. The hatch was redesigned, the materials were replaced, the atmosphere was changed. None of it changed what happened to 3 men who died without leaving Earth inside a spacecraft that should never have been cleared for a test. Soyuz 1, 1967. Vladimir Komarov knew the spacecraft was going to kill him. He flew anyway, because if he refused, his best friend would fly instead. In April 1967, Soviet engineers submitted a report documenting more than 200 design flaws in the new Soyuz spacecraft. The report was suppressed. The engineers who wrote it were reassigned. The launch date had been set for political reasons, and no one in the hierarchy was willing to delay it. Komarov knew. His backup pilot was Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space, the most famous face in the Soviet Union. If Komarov refused the mission, Gagarin would fly in his place. Komarov got in the capsule. Within hours of reaching orbit, it fell apart. One solar panel failed to deploy, cutting power in half. The orientation system malfunctioned. Manual controls barely responded. Komarov spent the mission fighting a dying spacecraft alone. On re-entry, the primary parachute failed to fully deploy. The backup tangled with it. Soyuz 1 hit the ground at nearly 90 miles per hour and exploded on impact. American intelligence agencies later claimed they intercepted Komarov's final transmissions. He was reportedly weeping with rage, cursing the engineers who built the spacecraft, knowing exactly what was coming. Gagarin was traveled to the landing site to wait for his friend. He was the first human to die during a spaceflight. The Soyuz program was grounded for 18 months. The 200-flaw report was declassified decades later. Every warning had been filed. Every engineer had known. The only thing that changed was the political deadline. Soyuz 11, 1971. 3 men landed perfectly after a record-breaking mission. Recovery crews opened the hatch and found them sitting in their seats, dead. On June 29, 1971, Soyuz 11 descended from the Salyut 1 space station after 23 days in orbit, the longest crewed mission in history at the time. The re-entry was clean. The parachutes opened on schedule. The capsule touched down on target in Kazakhstan. Recovery crews opened the hatch and found cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsiev exactly as they should be. No signs of panic, no signs of struggle. During the separation of the descent module, a pressure equalization valve opened at a height of 102 miles. The cabin depressurized in 112 seconds. None of the 3 men were wearing spacesuits. The Soyuz capsule had been redesigned to carry 3 crew members instead of 2. To fit the 3rd seat, the spacesuits were removed. Engineers raised concerns. They were overruled on weight and space constraints. The valve that failed had been identified as a weak point in previous ground testing. If any one of the crew had been wearing a suit, he could have survived long enough to close it manually. The handle was within arm's reach of every seat. All 3 received the Hero of the Soviet Union. The Soviet government withheld the cause of death. The program was redesigned to carry only 2 suited cosmonauts until a larger capsule could be built. 3 men, 1 valve, 1 decision to remove spacesuits to fit an extra seat, and 112 seconds that the engineers had already seen coming. Challenger, 1986. The night before the launch, 13 engineers told NASA not to fly. NASA launched anyway. On January 27, 1986, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, had been on the phone with NASA management for hours. The O-rings sealing the booster joints had never been certified below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The next morning's predicted launch temperature was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. In the cold, the rings would stiffen. They might not seal. Hot gas could breach the joint. The engineers said, "Do not launch." NASA's response, "Prove it's unsafe to fly." That is not how safety works. The burden of proof had been reversed. The engineers couldn't reframe years of safety data overnight. Management made the decision. The launch would proceed. At 11:38 a.m. on January 28th, Challenger lifted off with 7 crew members aboard. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire and the first civilian selected to fly to space. Millions of schoolchildren were watching live from classrooms. 73 seconds after launch, a compromised O-ring on the right solid rocket booster failed. Hot gas burned through the joint. The external fuel tank ruptured. Challenger broke apart at 46,000 feet, traveling at nearly 1,300 miles per hour. The crew cabin survived the initial breakup intact. Evidence showed that at least 3 crew members activated their emergency air packs afterward. They were alive. They fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before hitting the ocean. All 7 died. The Rogers Commission found NASA had known about O-ring erosion since 1977. The warnings had been filed, reviewed, and accepted as tolerable risk. The only thing that changed on January 28th was the temperature. Mars Climate Orbiter, 1999. It cost $327 million and 9 months to reach Mars. A single column of numbers with the wrong unit label destroyed it on arrival. On September 23, 1999, NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter fired its engine to enter Martian orbit. It never emerged behind the planet. Tracking confirmed it had come in at approximately 57 kilometers altitude instead of 140 to 150 kilometers. At that trajectory, the spacecraft either burned up in the atmosphere or skipped off it into deep space. Either way, it was gone. The investigation found the cause in 2 weeks. Lockheed Martin, the contractor responsible for the navigation software, had been transmitting thruster data to NASA in imperial units, pound force seconds. NASA's navigation team had been receiving that data and processing it as metric, Newton seconds. The two units differ by a factor of 4.45. This had been happening for months. For the entire 9-month journey, the navigation was slowly accumulating error. No one had verified the units. An engineer flagged a discrepancy 3 weeks before arrival. The concern was not escalated in time. $327 million, 3 years of development, 9 months in transit, destroyed because 2 teams used different unit systems and no one ran a basic cross-check. It was 1999, a spreadsheet could have caught it. The column had the wrong label and a spacecraft the size of a school bus burned up over Mars. Columbia, 2003. The damage was on the launch footage. 3 engineers requested satellite imagery to assess it. NASA said it wasn't necessary. On January 16, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia launched for mission STS-107. 82 seconds into liftoff, a piece of foam insulation broke from the external tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing. It had happened before. NASA had classified foam strikes as an accepted risk. 3 Boeing engineers submitted an urgent request to the Department of Defense. Could military imaging satellites photograph Columbia's damaged wing in orbit? If the heat shield tiles were breached, the crew needed options: a repair, a rescue mission, a plan. The request was forwarded to NASA management. It was denied. Management had already determined the foam strike was not a safety concern. The imagery wasn't needed because the conclusion had already been reached. For 16 days, Columbia orbited Earth. The crew performed experiments. They knew nothing. On February 1st, during re-entry, superheated plasma at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit entered the breach in the left wing. Structural sensors failed in sequence. At 8:09 a.m., Mission Control lost contact. Debris was reported over Texas and Louisiana. All 7 crew members died. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found that NASA's institutional culture bore as much responsibility as the foam. Engineers who raised concerns were made to feel like alarmists. The system had rewarded schedule over safety for years, and the foam strikes had gone wrong before, just never fatally. The shuttle program was grounded for 2.5 years. The launch footage existed. The foam strike was visible to anyone who looked. 3 engineers asked for 1 photograph. 17 years after Challenger, and 7 more people died because the answer was no.